There is always a story behind the story. Authors call this subtext, the underlying theme behind the writing. The author of Mark had something he wanted to highlight and have his listeners see in a new light. We have been watching all the Marvel movies in sequence with my oldest daughter Enna this last few weeks. And while all the action and aliens and special effects are amazing, the biggest wow moments come through the development and growth of the characters. It's this larger story and journey that keeps us interested as we watch. That's why it's fun to watch them in sequence and see how the stories evolve and combine in the end. In today's story, Jesus, the rabbi, enters the temple to teach. A rabbi would sit down, crisscross applesauce, and the students or disciples would surround the rabbi, and there would begin this interplay of storytelling, a theological interpretation of the Torah, and questions from students, allowing the teacher or rabbi to clarify an interpretation or a teaching. But today in the temple, there would be a teaching unlike the norm, different than any other rabbi in the temple. A man who is under the influence of an unclean spirit walks in. The unclean spirit speaks through the man and asks what Jesus' intention would be with him. At once, Jesus casts out the demon with his heavenly authority. This kind of story is not new in the Gospel of Mark. You could say that Jesus was on a roll of healing. Theologian David Bartlett says this: of the 18 miracles recorded in Mark, 13 have to do with healing, and 4 of the 13 are exorcisms. If nothing else, the early introduction of Jesus' healing power and the dominance of healing among the miracle stories suggest again what the scriptures had been hinting all along. That is, the intractable relation between religion and health. I'm fascinated by these. It's through these stories that we get a peek through the veil that seems to separate heaven and earth. The unclean spirit does not seem to question or argue Jesus' authority. They just want to know the agenda, the timeline. Jesus doesn't have to prove who he is. That's just not up for debate. These stories convey Jesus' divine power over all things earthly and heavenly. This is a rabbi, this is a teacher like none other. This rabbi speaks and acts with divine authority. I can't even imagine all the other rabbis in the temple after witnessing this. They must have been shook to the core, because after seeing this, life would never be the same. You've got to understand that in the first century, you could choose what rabbi to follow. You would choose your rabbi based on how he interpreted the Torah. Was it overly strict? Did they add on a ton of rules? Or did you like how he talked and explained things? Much in the same way that you might decide what church to go to depending on the pastor. Jesus was a rabbi, unlike any they had seen before. He spoke with defining and final authority, and then backed up his authority with action, with healing and casting out of an unclean spirit. I can't imagine how that must have perturbed the other rabbis in the temple, because it would have been painfully obvious that their rabbinical authority was not even in the same ballpark as Jesus. This also eliminated choice. As a disciple, you couldn't just pick a new narrative and a new rabbi if you didn't like his style. No alternative narratives or adjustable facts. Jesus' teaching, his word, his authority was obviously of God. It was final, and it was absolute. We live in strange times where everyone's picking narratives that appeal to what they already believe. You can pick your news sources. You can pick who you follow or don't follow on Facebook. You can pick your denomination based on how they worship or who they let in or keep out. Our lives are incredibly tailored to ourselves. And it's no wonder we get upset when someone rocks our boat with information that we don't like. What if I was to tell you that within these pages lies ultimate authority? That the God of the universe has incredibly definitive things to say on how we treat each other, how we interact with God, what's important and what's not important. Even more important than anything, though, I think God places our stories in a larger context, a larger framework, and makes our lives make sense. This last summer, or 2 summers ago, I spent 6 months as a chaplain at Advocate Condell Hospital in Libertyville. I worked the overnight shift from 7 p.m. to 8 in the morning. My 2 wards were the emergency room and the intensive care unit. And I dealt with families and individuals in crisis constantly. It was one of the most intimidating yet rewarding 6 months of my life. It was a strange environment to work in. Everyone else in the hospital, everyone on medical staff was focused on medical details. And people would ask doctors and nurses, were they going to be okay? Or how sick was their loved one? But as a chaplain, I didn't get medical questions, but I did get really big questions. Like, why is this happening? Or what do I do next? What does this mean for my life? Part of what I did was help people realize and process that life was going to be different, maybe never the same. I hung out with people shaken to the core. I remember going into one man's room at 1:30 in the morning who had throat cancer. He was a singer and a guitar player for close to 30 years, played in nightclubs all over Chicagoland. And his life, as he would tell me, had major ups and downs. He talked by pressing his thumb over an opening on his throat to speak through a modified mechanical vocal cord. His had been removed. He told me story after story of his life, times he screwed up, times he got it right, his relationship and ups and downs with his family. We talked for over 3 hours, and he was about to be discharged because as much as he was in pain, he said that he was done fighting the cancer. But there's always a story behind the story. Behind all his stories he told me was this undeniable search for meaning and for understanding. Was his life well spent? Did his life make sense? And in the grand scheme of things, did his life matter? I told him that I believed that Jesus could make sense of any story. Good stuff, bad stuff, all of it. And that I believed that Jesus has the authority to do so. To take all that you are, and through his power, his grace, his mercy and kindness, place your story in its proper context. I don't know where many of you are this morning, but I believe that the good news is that no matter what kind of story you have lived, no matter what kind of week you have had, or how life is going for you, that the author of life, the divine authority, can make sense of your story. Place it in its proper context, because Jesus has the authority and the power to do so. There is a story behind your story. It's a story of love, redemption, broken things being fixed, God's mission for his people, hearts being mended, hope being given to those who ask, and of a beautiful life to come, and so much more. Amen.